Hello, Friday again, World Economic News, and we're going to start with Janet Tavakoli and her repairing the damage of fraud as a business model. And it's her presentation to the Federal Housing Finance Agency Supervision Summit in Washington, D.C. And if you follow the link on the website, it's a 50 presentation, slides. And so I'm just going to give you the first one, which is entitled IMF, as in I am fantasizing IMF, the dispersion of credit risk by banks to a broader and more diverse set of investors, rather than warehousing such risks on their balance sheet, has helped to make the banking and overall financial system more resilient. This is a quote from the IMF that Janet is quoting. This is securitization. This means that the institutions that give loans no longer give loans to hold, they give loans to pass on to other people. It's a sucking mechanism, sucking and blowing. It sucks in and then it just blows on the compression stroke. It's open at the top and it then blows these loans out to other people. Okay, I'm going to move on. It's all connected, so pay attention. And you, Kitty, come on. Alphaville, rub-a-dub-dub in a 21 billion treasury tub. Investors sloshed and splashed in a $21 billion bloodbath on Wednesday. An auction of $21 billion worth of treasuries at 3.34% was the highest bid since May and well past the 2.64% yield last month's auction. So last month it was 2.64 on the Treasury and 3.34 now. There's an awful big difference between 2.64 and 3.34. Interest rate up, price down, or value down. Okay, moving on. That's just to show that interest rates on Treasuries are up and prices down. Moving on to Yahoo Finance, and consumer credit jumps by most in more than 2 years. It's all connected. Be connected yourself. Consumer borrowing rose in October, United States, by the largest amount in more than 2 years, led by a big rise in the category that includes student loans. From this article, I read, the Federal Reserve credit report showed that revolving credit, the category that includes credit card lending, or it is mainly credit card lending, dropped 8.4% in October, a record 26th consecutive monthly decline. United States people are not at the moment going out and bashing their credit cards like they used to. Understood. Households have been borrowing less and saving more and defaulting more. This has been a major factor holding back the overall economic growth because it depressed consumer spending, which accounts for the famous 70% of economic activity. The borrowing category that includes auto loans and student loans rose 6.8% in October, following a strong 7.6% increase in September. Much of that gain was powered by student loans from the federal government. A law change this year makes the government the primary lender to students. Previously, the federal government had been the guarantor of student loans that were being provided by private lenders. Some of the strength last month also came from a rise in auto loans, reflecting stronger auto sales. A separate report Tuesday showed that consumers with less than rock-solid credit were starting to get car loans again as lenders loosened standards a bit. So what I'm seeing is still a general reluctance to overspend, but the American psyche is so ingrained with certain habits. Having a car, and so what an important social status symbol a new car is, that's almost so ingrained it can never be got out. So the Americans are going back into the auto market. They're still laying off the credit cards a bit because they know they've been burnt there. And obviously student loans are on the rise because students have sensibly decided through this recession to go to school, college, university, whatever you want to call it, and get more diplomas so they can come at the end of the recession armed with their new diplomas in the new reviving economy, and everything should be fine. Moving on to a chart from financemoney.com. that gives us a chart from 1982 to 2008. It's not up to date, but it gives us the general picture of from 82 to 08. Consumer pricing index is up 100% from 82 to 08. Okay, median family income's up about 150%, so just about staying ahead of the consumer price index. We don't want to argue about that, that's not the point I'm making. Medical care is up 250%. College tuition fees are up 450%. So the people that have gone to college are paying huge for it now. It might work as a plan, it might not, because there's no real expectation that unemployment will fall much below 10% ever again. The Telegraph, Ambrose Evans Pritchard, who does know his United States, so it's not just the EU that he knows, he does know his United States. He writes, global bond rout deepens on US fiscal worries. Agreement in Washington on fresh fiscal package has set off dramatic rises in yields of US Treasury and bonds across the world. Japan even have risen interest rates to short-circuit any benefits of stimulus, and that's a fact. Your interest rate goes up, the effect of this stimulus is obviously negated to a certain extent. The bond rout raises concerns that the US authorities may be losing control over events. Now, I've pulled out a couple of parts of this article. David Bloom, currency chief at HSBC, said it is hard to disentangle whether investors are shunning bonds because they expect US stimulus to boost growth next year, or whether they are losing patience with profligacy in Washington. In other words, we'll get to that, but obviously, are the bonds going up in price because everything's turning out roses, or because the bond vigilante type thing where they're saying, no, you're borrowing too much, we want more interest? Nobody knows. If this is all about growth, that's brilliant. But if yields are rising because people think America's fiscal situation is unsustainable, then it's Armageddon, he said. That's restating what I just said there, I think. At the same time, this is later, at the same time, we've seen a loss of confidence in Fed strategy. There is a feeling that the Fed doesn't care about inflation. In fact, wants more of it. And that is certainly not in the interest of bondholders, because inflation can come up past the interest rate that you've agreed to, and when it does, you're on a losing wicket, because at the end of that year you've actually lost. And if inflation rate stays higher than the bond yield that you've agreed to, you're losing out every year. The standard rate for 30-year mortgages in the US has moved up in tandem with Treasury yields. The rate has been creeping up ever since the US Federal Reserve first signaled plans for a fresh blast of quantitative easing, rising 85 basis points in 3 months. At the end, we get Tom Porcelli from RBS Capital Markets said Fed rates might be nearer 4% by now if the Fed had not acted. It's hard to know what happens when the Fed or government don't act, but that he thinks they should be at, that'll be the 10-year at 4%. However, he said that there was no justification for QE2 at a time when the economy is growing. It might only be 2%, but it's growing at more than 2%, and core inflation, though the lowest since 1960s, is positive. In other words, it is positive, but it's very small inflation. Nobody believes that we're slipping into deflation anymore. That phase has passed, he said, and it could well might have done, but it might not have done. The last place we're going to gives us a nice chart. QE2's days are numbered, and there's an opening chart there. Since the end of August, when the Fed first began to hint that QE2 was in the works, yield on the 30-year Treasury bonds have jumped 95 basis points. It's repeating, but I'm getting there, driving the price of the long bond down by almost 15%. Driving the price of the long bond down by 15%. 30-year bond yields led the way initially because the market figured the Fed couldn't. It just didn't have the firepower to artificially depress the prices, as that's what Ben said he was going to do. That was the plan. But the bond market says, well, you haven't got the firepower to do it. And QE2 would make all bonds less attractive by increasing inflation. So it's just, people are stressing this, the conundrum that the Fed has got itself into. The only way to understand this paradoxical development, Fed purchase of bonds have caused their price to fall, and the rising bond yields seem to be improving the economic outlook, is to see it as the market's way of telling the Fed it would be making a big mistake if it forges ahead with QE2. The Fed can't depress 10-year yields if inflation is rising, and the economy is on the mend. QE2 needs to be shut down, and the sooner the better. It's all repeating the same. The economy is good enough that if they increase inflation, it's going to increase interest rates, which is going to harm the economy. So the Fed should butt out. There's a nice chart where he tries to explain this. He's put pink, green, yellow, blue, and in a chart with the yields of the 10-year as they've come down, jiggy jaggy, but come down since 2005. There was strong growth. So in 2006 and 7, so bond yields were up in the pink at over 5%. As 2008 came on, it went through average growth, and with bond yields at about 4.5. Later on, as it came recession time, the yields came down through slow growth at 3.5 to the blue, which is recession, at 2.5, and have dipped down into the 2% in 2009 when the most fear was about. But it's back up through the blue again. The economy is meant to be on the through recession period and hitting into slow growth, which is about 2%. But with these tax cuts now, it could be 3% next year, let's say, if all things were equal, which they're not, but that would be the idea. The Fed should pay attention to these important market signals. We don't need more QE2. The economy is doing okay, and Obama's tax deal, though far from perfect, should provide enough incentives to the private sector to result in stronger growth next year. The dollar is very weak and gold price is very high. Forward inflation expectations have risen from 2% to almost 3%, and commodities are on a tear. The Fed should begin to worry about getting too much of what it professes to want with QE2. So hopefully this whole video has given you some macro understanding of the Fed and the economy and how it all kind of is meant to work in with each other. But if we go back to Janet Tavakoli right at the beginning and securitization, this is the big problem, because that is what the economy was based on. The sucking and blowing out, sucking in of money and blowing it out in securitization around the world. That whole model is effectively broken, and it's very, very hard to know what will happen over the next couple of years in the overall economy with that old structure broken. That is the one reason to hang on to deflationary ideas, because that with that system broken, the pump isn't going to circulate the monies around enough to enough people, and that will create asset price problems. There still will be pressure on asset prices. The pressure is for them to fall. That's it. Have a good weekend. Bye.